All right, guys, so as we finish up our review on American history for this class, we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, Section 4. And so the big idea here is how political principles and major events shape how people form government. And so a few of the terms that we'll be seeing throughout this lesson: mercantilism, the theory that a nation's security is dependent on its wealth, and that wealth is dependent on a favorable balance of trade, meaning basically in this time that we're selling more things than we're bringing in. And we'll see why that's so important to the story of the American Revolution, and really how understanding the economics of the colonial era is essential to understanding the rest of the story. Okay, so we'll start with a question here. So mercantilism is the concept that wealth is equated to power, and that power is necessary for safety. So safety and stability being one of the primary purposes of a national government. And so just be thinking about that, is wealth truly synonymous with power, and is power necessary? Does this theory hold out in the modern era? Okay, so as we're looking at colonial resistance and how the American colonists began against British control, excuse me, I wanted to begin by just looking at why. Why would the American colonists seek to rebel against British control? Excuse me. And so I wanted to start with this theory about self-government and cellulatory neglect. And excuse me, I'm going to get some. All right, so cellulatory neglect is the idea that the British didn't really care what the American colonists did, as long as the American colonists continued to produce profit and revenue for the British government. And so as long as the British were making money, the American colonists had self-government. And this is really because of this theory of mercantilism. It's the idea that, excuse me, that the British government wasn't extending its influence into the colonies for the sake of power. It was doing it for the sake of wealth. And this is because the theory of mercantilism rests on the theory that a country's power, or safety even, depends on its wealth, and that wealth is generated from a favorable balance of trade. And so the colonies weren't an extension of power, that you think of empire in like the sake of Star Wars, how the empire was expanding its influence for the sake of power. No, it's the opposite. The British Empire was expanding its influence. Why? Two main reasons: that the colonies were a source of cheap raw materials, and that the colonies were a market for these finished goods that were coming from Great Britain. And so the second piece, the market for these finished goods, was the real reason here for the Navigation Acts, that the colonies could only sell their export materials to the mother country, and they could only buy the finished products from the mother country. And so, for example, for the British colonists to sell goods to, say, Spain or France would have been a violation of the Navigation. And so this was all well and good for quite a while, until the French and Indian War. And because the French and the British were fighting, and because that fighting extended into the British colonies, this became a very expensive war. In fact, you could argue that the 7 Years' War was really the first global conflict. And so just a quick review: to pay for the war, the British levied the Stamp Act on the American colonists, just to raise funds, because they were sending British troops over to the American colonies to fight the French, to defend the British colonists there. And so the British felt they were within their rights to pass on some of the expense of the war to the American colonists. But really, this war was the very first time that any ideas of independence were being discussed by the British colonists. And the first evidence of this is the Albany Plan. And it was this plan that all of the colonies should unite in some way. And so this first idea of any type of united colonial system was proposed by Ben. And so the French and Indian War wound up being a resounding British victory. But as I said, though the British won, they did so at great cost. And this cost necessitated the Stamp Act, which levied a tax on the British colonists to pay for the French and Indian War. Another law that the British passed on the American colonists that was extremely controversial was the Quartering Act. And this meant that in a time of war, the British military may need to quarter or to station soldiers in colonists' homes. And that was because of just the necessities of conflict. If, say, the British Army were stationed in Philadelphia and they have an army of tens of thousands protecting a city of over 1 million people, then they may need to station those soldiers throughout the city because they don't have a base of operations that could support that large of a force. So in terms of British military policy, it made sense, but the idea of it was offensive to the American colonists, because here's the British government saying, we can take over your house if necessary to station soldiers. And so this resulted in really the first actions that the American colonists were taking against the British government. And the first actions were economic, going back to that theory of mercantilism. The American colonists said, look, if you don't change the Quartering Act, if you don't get rid of the Stamp Act, then we're going to stop buying your goods. And so the American colonists began to adopt this idea of a British boycott. And it was particularly because of the Stamp Act, and Samuel Adams organized this boycott with his group that he called the Sons of Liberty. In fact, the very first steps that the American colonists were taking against the British government were because of the Stamp Act. And it was just such an offensive concept that the British government was levying this tax on American colonists, and that the colonists had no representation, no say in Parliament, which had previously left them alone. I mean, yes, the British were the kind of mother country, the umbrella government over the American colonists, but because of cellulatory neglect, the British didn't care what the colonists did. But the Stamp Act was the first form of direct control. And it was just simply a problem to the point where the first organization of British colonies was named after the Stamp Act, called the Stamp Act Congress. And the first decision of the Stamp Act Congress was a boycott, that the American colonies who met at the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 agreed that they would levy a boycott, or they would just refuse to purchase British goods. And it was also at this Congress that a first formal declaration of grievances were sent to the British king. Now, it's worth noting that the British Parliament had no interest really in levying control over the British colonies, that the Stamp Act wasn't a symbolic measure of authority, that it really was economic. It really was just the British government needed to raise funds to pay for the French and Indian War. And they had no interest in upsetting the colonists. They wanted to eventually go back to this position of cellulatory neglect. And so when the Declaration of Rights and Grievances were sent to the British king, Parliament acquiesced. They said, look, okay, we'll get rid of the Stamp Act. However, In the process of doing so, Parliament also passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that the British government had no real interest in exercising direct control over the colonies. However, they maintained the right, if necessary, to impose taxes on the colonists. And in response to the boycott, which the British saw as a step in the direction of revolution, which really that's, historically one of the biggest weaknesses in imperial control is when one colony begins to rebel, it leads to subsequent rebellions and eventually the end of an empire. And so the British government had to make sure that, if necessary, they could impose laws on their colonies. And so the Declaratory Act said we do still maintain that authority. And the Townshend Act really, while the Stamp Act went away, the Townshend Act placed new taxes on different goods, really on goods coming into the country, on imports. And this led to further boycotts, and this led to colonists destroying British property. Particularly the most famous incident of this is the Boston Tea Party, where these taxes on imports were affecting only the British colonists, but not other British citizens. For example, the British East India Company, who were doing business around the world, weren't having to pay these taxes on tea. And so as a result, the American colonists got together and began destroying shipments of tea that were coming in, particularly in the Boston harbor. And as a result, the British military intervened and declared martial law on the city of Boston and began to patrol the streets looking for dissenters or people who might cause riots. And the first instance of violence in the American Revolution was known as the Boston Massacre, where the police were, the British military were attempting to impose order in a city that they saw was in a state of unrest, and a group of protesters began to throw rocks and chunks of ice at the British soldiers. And so the soldiers opened fire on the crowd. And only a few people died, but the newspapers began to call it the Boston Massacre. Now, the Tea Act, as I said, gave the East India Company exceptions to these import taxes, that they wouldn't have to pay the taxes that were being levied on the British colonists. And so this gave an unfair advantage to the East India Company, a British-owned company that was doing international business, and it gave them an unfair economic advantage against the colonial merchants. And so it was really this economic advantage, this sign of economic imperialism, that prompted these business leaders to organize the Boston Tea Party. And as I said, the government's response was to further limit colonist civil rights. That cellulatory neglect only works as long as the British colonists are content and adhere to the few laws the British government passes on them. But when a colony begins to show signs of unrest, then the British imperial policy was to begin to kind of crank down, to begin to restrict rights and impose controls and increase military presence. And that's exactly what they did with the coercive, or also known as the intolerable acts. So acts restricted the rights of the colonists and further motivated colonists to take steps toward independence. And in fact, they did so with the organization of the First Continental Congress, where delegates were sent from 12 of the 13 colonies. And the idea here, and I say 12 and not 13 because the colony of New Jersey was known as a royal colony, meaning it was directly controlled by the British government. And so the governor of New Jersey was a British royal agent. In fact, it was Ben Franklin's son, who at the time of the Revolution was the governor, the royal governor of New Jersey. So really delegates from just the other 12 colonies, and they agreed to a goal that they would only be content when all the rights prior to the French and Indian War were restored to the colonists. That basically, unless the British government went back to a system of cellulatory neglect with none of the taxes that had been imposed, then a further extension of boycott of any British goods would continue to be the policy sought. And so now the British are dealing with the American colonies who are trending toward insurrection. And so, think about this when a city or a region are in a state of civil unrest. Well, what's the response? Well, the government's going to send in the National Guard or the military if necessary to quell unrest and to restore order. And so that's actually what the British government did when they sent soldiers to Boston. And when they learned that these operations were being staged in Lexington and Concord, then the British military was ordered to move to these areas and to do something about it. And so Lexington and Concord heard about the British Army moving their direction, and so they organized and they were ready. And so this resulted in the battles of Lexington and Concord, which, though they were very limited engagements, these are seen as really the first shots fired in the Revolutionary War. And so you could argue that the Revolutionary War here began with the battles of Lexington and Concord and the formation of the Second Continental Congress, which met in 1775 and decided formally by 1776 that independence against Great Britain would be the common goal of the British colony. But this was a tough sell. Not every colonist felt that independence was lawful or even practical. And so Thomas Paine wrote a leaflet called Common Sense, and there's a copy in my room if you guys ever want to borrow it. But it was considered an influential work that did inspire many of the colonists to seek independence against Great Britain. But what was the book about? What was this short leaflet? Well, for one, Thomas Paine argued that complete independence from Great Britain would be necessary. And it argued this basically on a few key points. Number one, that it would be necessary economically, that unless the British government were removed from the economic process of the British colonies, that they would never thrive. And then also philosophically, the idea that here the British government is imposing these laws, but philosophically they don't have the right to. Going back to John Locke, that really, if government is a social contract, then the government has to provide representation. They have to listen to and consider the interests of the people. And so on July 4th, independence was formally declared with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And so just kind of a rough paraphrase of the Declaration. Number one, the British government was not looking after the interests of the colonies. Number two, King George was a tyrant. Tyrant just means someone who has seized power. Doesn't mean they're a bad person necessarily. In fact, the Greek concept of tyrant was sometimes that someone would necessarily seize power in the event of an emergency. But in this case, they're definitely using tyrant in a negative context because, well, they had no opportunity to pick the king or to vote someone else into power. And the Declaration of Independence, of course, upholds and maintains these rights that individuals have. And so that's the piece that we all know, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that these are just inalienable rights that we have because we're humans. And also this concept of the social government, that the purpose of government, after all, is to protect these inalienable rights, and that if it fails to do so, then it's failed to uphold the social contract, and that after all, government in theory is based on the consent of the people. And so if the people don't consent to be governed by the British, then the British have lost the right to govern. And John Locke's theory gets extreme when he says that if a government violates its social contract, and if the government is depriving people of their basic rights, the people have the right to overthrow that government. And like I said, this is very much John Locke, if you ever read his work, The Declaration of the Rights of Man. And so the Declaration was written by Thomas Jefferson. It was approved by the Second Continental Congress, July 4th of 1776, and of course we celebrate this now